you're UCD Law A, and you guys are Hong Kong UST B.
Yep.
Everyone's in the right place. Does anyone else have good dictators? I'm not quite sure what they are. We might do gender pronouns while we're waiting, just so that they can do this when they come in. I'm Amy. I'm the chair, and my gender pronoun is she.
I am Neil, prefer he.
So John speaking first. He. Arden, Tom, he.
Lily, she. Evelyn, she and me.
Or he. Anyone else prefer he? AJ, I prefer he.
One's in, I prefer he.
No,
I don't know where they are. Okay. Do you want to do your gender pronouns?
She, her.
Cool. So, without further ado, someone goes off. Okay? I invite John to speak to the motion that this House would allow states to use mercenary forces in combat roles in active military operations.
In Baghdad in 2011, when Western forces were forced to remove themselves from the green zone in Baghdad, it would have been unlikely in the absence of private military contractors that the security of that region could have been secured. From opening government, Cambridge A thinks the following: sometimes conflicts are messy and domestic political considerations and other things mean that we're not able to deploy the troops we need, and that private military contractors and mercenaries allow a great degree of flexibility and transparency where otherwise there would be none. What is our model? We support three things. First of all, we intend to remove domestic constraints and international sanctions from countries who use these sorts of forces. Second of all, we support the sorts of information sharing that are already commonplace, where countries tell each other which private military contractors and mercenaries have committed human rights abuses in the past. Third of all, we think obviously these sorts of groups will be held to standards. In particular, we would sanction states that continue to use groups that have committed human rights abuses in the past, in the same way we sanction states who have committed the human rights abuses themselves. And let's be very realistic in this debate, right? Vast numbers of countries that may commit abuses want these troops. That's why they get mercenaries in the first place. So it will be insufficient for the opposition team to say these could be abused, because realistically, where a state wants to commit a dirty conflict and abuse them, the alternative in the absence of mercenaries is simply to recruit their own domestic forces and commit the atrocities in that way. I'm going to make two arguments in this speech. First of all, why this will improve the standard of conflicts, and second of all, why it has excellent accountability. First of all, why are mercenaries and private military contractors excellent in improving various kinds of conflicts? The vast majority of instances where a government will rely or hire one of these companies are instances where they do not feel they have the apparatus themselves to work effectively in that situation. These are things like locational, where they are located, or the knowledge that these groups have on the ground. So we think that private military contractors and mercenaries improve situations. How do they do so? First of all, in instances of disaster relief and peacekeeping, it is simply a reality that not every nation can keep troops in every situation on the ground, in every place where they would be needed. A good example of this would be the French interest in Mali, for instance. Lots of human rights abuses occur there because there can be flare-ups of violence. Nonetheless, France cannot keep troops in that location to be used at short notice. What private military contractors and mercenaries do allow states in instances of very critical human rights abuses to have a force on the ground that can very rapidly mobilize, right? The alternative in a world in which these things are not allowed or not commonplace is simply that these abuses take place. Second of all, political constraints. First of all, because certain countries cannot deploy troops in certain areas. For instance, United States military bases cannot be located in vast parts of the Arab world because it would simply antagonize the local population to an extent that was sort of counterproductive to aims. Nonetheless, we think that a US military presence would be an exceptional stabilizing force to a large degree of these areas, because the simple threat of US force is enough to deter various groups from escalating the conflict or trying to commit abuses of human rights. So it's important that countries and groups on the ground that would commit abuses know that these places have the capacity to rapidly scale forces and deploy in situations where they otherwise wouldn't. So it's an important deterrent effect to happen. Second of all, in terms of specific aims, one of the ways the United States government protected the economy of Iraq as they decided to pull out was to use private military contractors and mercenaries to defend things like oil wells. They could not defend them with their own forces because it politically looked too bad for the US military to be sitting there protecting a US oil company, right? They could, however, use the proxy of a mercenary force to protect those things. And crucially, that oil was absolutely vital for the economy of Iraq to function, for people on the ground to be able to live their lives in a stable way. So allow that sort of flexibility in deployment that otherwise we would not have. Third of all, with respect to the body bag effect, right? Because look at the example of Mogadishu, where people being dragged through the streets was enough to allow that government to withdraw in instances where there was clear and pressing need for human rights intervention, right? The reality in this debate is that people in the Western world, for instance, in particular, and people in general are very war-weary. We do not like intervention anymore because it has been going on for far too long in the minds of that many people, which means we have a bias towards not intervening where otherwise we should. That's why any argument for opposition in this debate that says, well, private military contractors allow governments to be more aggressive in the way they deploy their forces doesn't mesh with the reality of the situation. We have been intervening and people do not want to be intervening more. Nonetheless, it is true that we probably should in a large degree of instances. Third of all, with respect to information, we think that lots of private military contractors have a substantial advantage with respect to information on the ground. That means we can get forces who are able to better engage with people and get connections that we otherwise wouldn't. But crucially, it also allows our interventions to not antagonize local populations in a certain degree of instances. Having someone who looks like you, speaks your language, and is respected in the area is often an important thing to prevent your intervention from inflaming conflict. That sort of flexibility, again, is important. Second argument, about accountability. We think that traditional militaries tend not to report abuses, or at least they have difficulties in doing so for a number of reasons. Why? In the first instance, because they have an incentive to cover up. Lots of militaries around the world, from the Western world to the developing world, do not want to be seen as a government that supports a state-sanctioned terror or state-sanctioned human rights abuses. That means that when these abuses occur, there are incentives not to reveal those things to the public. Second of all, most of these nations tend to have the protection of military courts. So in the first instance, lots of these cases are simply not able to be brought by various people, because if you're a citizen in Iraq, in some instances, you may not have standing to bring a case against the US military. But additionally, it means the situation is far more opaque. Why are private military contractors far better with respect to accountability, both in the Western world and developing world? First of all, because with respect to their corporate image, we think that it is simply the case that, for instance, when the Tahrir Square massacre occurred, and regrettably, I'll take you in a second, sir, the Bridgewater private military contractor did commit some form of human rights abuses. They faced huge international backlash and economic destitution, as well, had to reform themselves to remove the people from that institution. The military has to do no such thing, sure.
Sir, since they are more likely to benefit financially if they do not commit these abuses, they're more likely to hide these abuses if they occur in the first place, because otherwise they'll lose their contracts. How do you feel about that?
So to be incredibly clear, it is exceptionally obvious when a private military contractor commits an abuse compared to the military. Why? Because they're often in situations where the conflict is far more confusing or diverse, so there's not the sort of same situation on the ground, right? Additionally, it's very easy for us to mandate things in contracts like, for instance, you have to have cameras on your troops order, you have to report things that have a very visible structure. Additionally, notice that it's in the incentives of the private military contractor to actually be very open about the sorts of things that go wrong. For instance, in the military, a general's not going to report on abuses because I know that that looks badly on the military as a whole. A high-up person at PMC may well report on the abuses of someone lower down because they want to cut that contagion out before it becomes another Tahrir Square and brings the entire company down, right? Basic standards of corporate accountability allow for that sort of granularity of revealing of abuses that doesn't happen in the military. Second of all, with respect to evidence collection, because we can try these people in civilian of cause, means there's a lower burden for people actually proving atrocities, which is another reason why the accountability is high, because the sorts of evidence that people on the ground might bring to us are things that are actually admissible in court, rather than simply being covered up as things that are US military secrets. Third of all, also, let's be very realistic in this debate, right? The comparison is realistically, say for instance in Africa where lots of countries already fund lots of proxies, right? And you may have some concern along the lines of, well, won't this just allow them to hire more of these groups? If a group wants to hire troops to make themselves feel safe or secure or to pursue a particular agenda, there is no deficit of these sorts of groups that they can appeal to, right? There are lots of ethno-militias, there are lots of people they can pull out of poverty to fight these sorts of wars for them. That is why the comparative is worse, right? Because we would prefer they were hiring an international company that was very vetted on the international scene and well known, and they were hiring people and they tended to dominate that market, rather than allowing these governments to perpetually rely on people who would be far more willing to commit abuses or far more likely to ingrain an ethnic divide through that conflict because they're specifically hired on the grounds that they are purging some other groups of people. This allows for an exceptional degree of transparency in a lot of conflicts where otherwise it would be lacking and will improve human rights. We're very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for his speech and welcome the opposition leader to open the oral case.
Using mercenary forces inside combat roles, especially in active military operations, we see as could be very problematic, like what is happening in Yemen. It creates a proxy war that's like creating that's making it harder for people to actually see who is like creating a puppet war that's involving a lot of actors. We see that the best way for countries to actually have their own military operations is to actually use their own military forces, because what we see is that military forces, because we see that each country has their own like interests and how they have already created these military forces, which creates a better accountability later on, and creating a better way for these people to fight for their own country. So let's no thank you. So first of all, let's our mechanism in this in this case is, if there are too little people inside the military, we would let them use like military conscriptions, like how it's happening in like Singapore or Korea, and also create a better system of training for these military systems. So going on to my rebuttals, they have already told from their debate, from the Prime Minister, he has already told us that it's good because they have not enough apparatus, and it's easier to collect information, and and it's better for accountability. So first rebuttal: if there are not enough apparatus, we believe that there are still a lot of ways that a country can actually get people, like what I've told you before with military conscriptions, for instance. We see that through military trainings of each country, it is better because the military are these trained government officials whose job is to ensure like their own security, protection, and to ensure that people's rights are not being violated. We believe that through these kinds of trainings that a country has given, it is the country has more control on what is trained to these military people, so that later on in the field they will be like more experienced through a training that the government has already agreed to. Whereas with mercenaries, they are trained by the companies, for instance, or like they are people. There are other people who are not who are not consented to like human rights abuse and other kinds of things. Second of all, about the better information, because they're using locals, we believe that we believe that if you're like only looking for informations, etc., it is okay to find local people. But when you're actually involved in combat roles, it is very problematic, because these mercenaries are not like they are not consented towards like creating a better platform to saving these people. They're more focused on like making sure that their mission is fulfilled, rather than saving these locals in the first place. Third of all, for accountability, we believe that each country has their own set of rules towards accountability. Like they cannot be human rights abuse, because we see that there's already enough accountability from like the mandate of the people towards the government, and we see that there's already enough in status quo. Before that, any POIs?
So in Mali, when violence flared up, the government there simply did not have the capacity to fight back against the militias that came up. Why should people in that country have to die because France doesn't have the capacity to very rapidly stop that conflict escalating?
We believe that even though each government has in cases like in immediate cases where the government don't seem like they're lacking people, we see that it's still not okay for them to use combating roles. We see that there are still better ways for the government to use their military forces, for instance, like use the police forces, etc., rather than using these mercenary forces. So going on to my arguments about the different interests between the mercenary and the military, the government military. Let's see the characters of these mercenaries, right? They're a group of people who are paid to do a certain mission. Their pay grade are really high, and they're trained to do whatever it takes to complete the mission. Whereas in military forces, they are more trained government officials whose job is is towards the people. We see that it's problematic because when we see the interest, these mercenaries are more drawn towards getting like profit, their money, and getting power, for instance, in the country, whereas the government wants the protection of people. Like, what would happen is that in times of war or critical cases, these mercenaries would focus on trying to they would do anything to actually do what they are assigned to. It's like everything they do is fair for them. Whereas in military, they still have like their own code of conduct. They would not hurt their civilians. Their priority are already the civilians. The government, the government's role in this case is to protect the civilians, and their interest is keeping the people still protected. They keep the mandate of the people, and thus creating a trust toward the government, which would create like a secure would make the people feel like more secure. We see that security can only be achieved when the people are already like we believe that security can be achieved where the people actually like trust the people that are protecting them, which is why we believe that the government should have like more control in like firstly the trainings, and then how they're actually doing things, which is why the military is the best option for these people, and especially for these people, because they would more likely to adhere to the government's interest rather than the mercenaries. Even though the mercenaries would have like their own contract, etc., we believe that it's not as binding as what happens in military, because in military they are like trained to help protect the people, etc. Since the very first time that they are inside the military. So the idea is more ingrained, which is why we believe that mercenary forces should not be there in combat roles. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the opposition leader for his speech and welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
When Blackwater Security was found to be complicit in the Nazir Square massacre, the result was there was a huge backlash which led to that company losing contracts worth tens of millions of dollars and eventually going into insolvency. Compare this to what occurs when the US military itself is involved in abuses. What we saw in the case of Abu Ghraib was a systemic cover-up at all levels to hide the information from ever getting out. In one case, the US military were prepared to throw their contractors under the bus because they had screwed around and broke human rights law. When that occurs within the military, incentives occur that mean we don't get the same transparency, and as a result we get cover-ups. Furthermore, we don't have the same operational capability, which means we're not able to fight a lot of the wars where we need to be involved in order to intervene in favour of human rights. 2 points in this speech. First, I'm going to look at why private military contractors and mercenaries have better operational capabilities, and secondly, I'm going to look at transparency. To the first point on operational capability, what they said was that what they supported was the militaries around the world using conscription or other methods in order to be able to get recruits available. Note for one thing that using conscripts is arguably a human rights abuse in and of itself, but furthermore it's unlikely that your newly found conscripts are likely to be able to fight with the same knowledge and expertise of fighting in difficult guerrilla war situations that the individuals who are part of PMCs usually are. So the vast majority of PMCs aren't new individuals who need to be trained up. They're usually people who are ex-military in and of themselves, who have served as part of US government forces or government forces somewhere else and have then pursued a lucrative private sector career based on their particular expertise. So the gap in the level of training we need to provide immediately is huge. So even if conscription was a valid option for them to use, it's still one that results in a military which is less able to fight the wars where we need to be able to intervene incredibly quickly. So note, for example, that when a dictator, for example, the US had to have strike capability in order to intervene in the no-fly zone in Libya in 2011 within 48 hours to stop the Benghazi massacre. So the US happened to have military bases within that particular region of the world and were able to deploy incredibly rapidly as a result of Arab League allies. That is not the case everywhere in the world, in which there might be an immediate humanitarian crisis that requires the West to be able to intervene on behalf of the people who live in that nation. So having the capability to be able to use local forces who have specific deployment capability in a wide range of countries is incredibly important. John's given you reasons why it is that we can't have countries maintaining strike capability everywhere. One of those reasons is just that it's simply impossible, particularly when military budgets happen to be particularly constrained. But furthermore, often having a military base within a given country is something that antagonizes the very forces which are likely to result in uprisings or political problems. So, for example, note that in Japan, there have been tens of thousands of cases from people based on US military bases committing crimes up to and including rape and murder. That is something which is incredibly offensive to Japanese people, but is even more important when people have an ideological disposition against the US, as happens in many countries across the Arab world and the wider Middle East and African region. So that means it's impractical to maintain forces everywhere, and as a result, we often need to be able to maintain some ability to intervene quickly using other forces, sure.
Sir, the debate's about active military operations, which can be defined as operations which are currently ongoing. The debate here is taking a shape which is about operations which may happen. Could you please redefine it and go in the right direction?
So it's about all types of operations, but even if you have the ability to be involved in active operations in a particular theatre of war, there are often changes in the amount of forces that you are needed within that particular war. So it's incredibly difficult to deploy forces necessary, say if there were an uprising within a particular country that was unexpected where you already have some forces stationed. Being able to get additional forces and additional strike power when it's necessary is something incredibly important. We're not going down the wrong direction. I'm not sure what direction you guys are trying to go down there. Furthermore, when you use conscripts, you're likely to get people who are unwilling to be able to consent to many of the very risky types of war that are being fought. Note that the situations where we use military contractors are often highly politically fraught ones, where people need to have particular expertise. Conscripting some inner city kid in order to be able to fight that war is something that we think is a gross human rights abuse and one that they shouldn't be standing for. We've also given you a wealth of analysis about how using mercenaries allows cooperation between governments and private entities that might otherwise be politically infeasible. So note that in 2011 there was a negotiation between the Somalian government and a number of international governments that also took place with a number of shipping agencies and insurance companies as part of a consortium. This was a particularly effective way of getting forces who were able to fight Somalian pirates, which ultimately led to a reduction of 75% in average insurance tariffs that were paid for ships moving through the region. That's something that's incredibly valuable to the economy of the region when you're able to cooperate with the basic primary and secondary industries that are important to that economy being able to succeed. But it's often politically unpopular for a particular military to intervene directly on the part of a private agent. But when you're able to form consortia with private agents and as a result pay private military contractors or mercenaries to be able to undertake that, it becomes far more feasible to be able to defend the resources that are important for development, sure.
Please explain to us why by creating a proxy war will eventually solve the problem, because what happened in the status quo in the Middle East, especially in Yemen, when countries are having, while countries are paying the mercenary, in the end of the day the problem is not solved. But
Okay. So this debate is not about Iran paying the Houthis, something we think would largely occur and occurs outside of the bounds of international law. This debate, and I'm talking about transparency now, is about when countries pay particular military contractors to undertake operations. It was incredibly clear that Blackwater was being paid by the US, and there are documents and procurement contracts to the extent that that's transparent and available. Why is this important? They've simply told us that the fact there's a profit motive that exists skews incentives here. We believe that it skews incentives in a good direction, because across a company involving thousands of individuals, just like any military, you're likely to have a few bad eggs, but that's likely to be insufficient in order to lose that contract if that's revealed. That means that private military contractors like G4S or XE Security Consulting are highly likely to use to rat out the individuals at the bottom who have been causing problems before it causes greater issues for their shareholders and greater problems for their bottom line. They're largely willing to undergo a few bad reputational loss in the short term in order to avoid the total collapse of the company. While private military contractors are never going to be perfect, that's simply a reality of any war. They're more transparent and have a direct operational capability that often exceeds that of the military. Very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his speech, and welcome the Deputy Opposition Leader to continue their case.
idea of proxy war itself, we believe that it's not a good thing because what happens by the intervention of having this proxy war will eventually lead to something that is more harmful, dangerous in the ground rather than actually solving the problems of the conflict itself. Let's say that they are talking about how we don't have enough military troops inside of the ground, that we need local people that is actually can talk with the local and can be trusted. But what happened in the status quo is that it doesn't solve the problem, and it eventually only create more conflict inside of the battleground. And if they're saying that there are some countries that doesn't want to directly interfere or put their troops on the ground because it doesn't meet their interest. We see that, but this is not aligned with the spirit of the country, especially the Western that is being no thank you that is being the superpower that have. That also have the biggest mandate to protect the peace in the world. That when they don't want to seem like a bad guy, but when the intervention succeed, they will eventually take the platform that's saying, oh, we are the one who do this. But when it fails, it will eventually they will keep pointing fingers of who groups are actually causing the problems. So we see that by having the idea of proxy war. No, thank you. It's not a good thing, but and only create more conflict inside of the ground. But then let's move on to my extension on how I'm going to explain on how by the increased use or demand of having these mercenary forces will eventually lead to many more companies are going to compete in to no thank you to create this surface. And with this kind of surface means that there will be more weapons on the circulation, and there will be the idea of who have the better choice. There will be competition on how or who develop the better surface on the weapons, which is the basic idea or the start when people start to do dangerous experiment and cross the line of humanity. But before that, yes.
It's highly unlikely that you'll be able to stop corrupt and despotic regimes bribing local tribesmen to fight on your behalf. Why do you want to stop multinational corporations that have operational advantages being hired through transparent contracts?
Because what happens with companies is that their main idea is to have profit. It's not aligned with the spirit of the military inside of the country itself. We see that when people are going after, especially because you are providing service, is that you are aftering the money or the profit that will be eventually given by the government. We see that this is not what, if you want to solve the problem of humanitarian crisis, it should not based on the idea of having a profit or the money itself. It should be based on how you want to stop the humanitarian crisis, of how you want to solve the conflict, and etc. So we think that it's not aligned with the spirit of how we are going to solve the conflict itself. But let's move on to my extension on how I've explained to you how it will only create competition or emerging market on how these companies will eventually compete on who have the better idea of who have the better choice. There will be competition on how you're going to advance the other companies or how you're going to give the service. And this is the basic idea or the start when people start to do dangerous experiment and cross the line of humanity. Like for example, you will when you are trying to give the government on how you can give how you are better than the other company, you will even do an experiment on how to create a superhuman. You will have genetic experiments, or even though you will no, thank you. Or you will create drugs that enhance the capability of the skill of the mercenary human itself. And we think that this will be very dangerous. Will be a very dangerous a thing to do because it's not aligned with what we are trying to achieve. No, thank you. And aside from that, there will what also happens in the status quo. You are aside from experiment with human, you are also eventually start to experiments who create the better weapons and these weapons that is not being legalized or legalized by the or not being accepted by the government to use inside of the war itself can be very dangerous, because because once you start to create weapons, you will test it in the war or the mission that you're going to apply, and this can be very dangerous. And my first speaker already explained to you on how the difference of the military troops and this mercenary forces have different interests, on how military troops have their code of conduct on how they are not going to attack try not to attack the civilians and etc. But what most likely to happen with these mercenary forces is that they are still trying to finish their missions, and they're trying to finish their mission no matter what going to happen. Even if you create a contract with them, there will still be chances that you can violate them, and in these cases, the mercenary forces are not only from the companies, as I explained it. There can be individuals that you can hire and etc. And this can be very dangerous. If it eventually hurt or create more conflict inside of the battleground itself. So we see that we are going to stick with this. We are going to stick with using our own military troops instead of using mercenary forces or bounty killers and etc. And we are going to stick with the spirit of how we are going to solve the problems by using our military troops instead of creating the future dangers that we don't know what will happen inside of the battleground itself. So we are more than proud to oppose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Op Leader for her speech and welcome the government member to the open.
As has been pointed out, we're talking about conflicts that are already ongoing. It's not just that military contractors can be deployed instead of an army. Given that we're talking about those two things working in tandem, what we need to prove in closing government is that it is legitimate to do so with the aims of what we have when an army goes to war. And secondly, we're going to build on what is given by first prop and talk to you about why specifically these contractors are more efficient at the type of things that they're likely to be doing. Before that, two pieces of rebuttal that don't quite fit in. We have this contention from opening opposition about how we need these companies or how we need soldiers in general to act in a responsible manner, and that's how we get the good outcomes that we have from armies generally. We tell you that, like, in order for these companies will be held to account from the simple fact that they simply won't be hired if they're not matching the aims of those governments. So if they're not paying their employees enough, or if they're treating them very badly, or treating the people that they're fighting against like inhumanely, then they simply won't be hired, because it's a PR disaster for any government to be using them. See Blackwater, how it was the US that was using that agency and then had to answer, not just as a corporation but as a government, to its people that it was using an agency that was doing a bad thing. Secondly, we're told that other specific abuses might happen in terms of maybe things like experimentation, or when you have individual soldiers being hired and doing their own thing. Even if first prop aren't correct, and like we can't somehow have some sort of profit motive using as a self-regulatory manner, like those individuals simply cannot be hired by a government like that wants to be able to fight in those areas. It's simply not going to like align themselves with people that have been dishonorably discharged, because that brings bad name not just to those individuals and the government, but to the army that is also going to be fighting alongside them, because people don't generally distinguish between the two, like the white oppressive forces that are invading. Like they have to fight alongside them, so the legitimacy of those private troops also will matter to the government. That's why they won't hire them. So let's look at the morality of an occupying force, because we think governments, when they use their army and deploy them in foreign countries, as we're talking about, have a duty to balance the political outcomes with protecting the most people. We think that's why it's sometimes okay for governments to use their armies for political ends. However, in this specific circumstance, they've already done that. So we see, like in the example of Iraq, the government has already gone in by itself and done a good job of steamrolling the country and achieved the very basic military aims that it wanted. However, what comes next is extremely important, because we think
think at that point, once you are an invading force within an army and are literally taking control of someone else's country, the duty is upon you as a government to use the most effective outcome and the potentially quickest outcome to solve that conflict. We think that comes from private military contractors, because at that point, any further delay in you exiting that country in an orderly fashion, or any further delay in you achieving your military aims, means that more people die. Not just more of your own soldiers, but more likely more civilians within those countries. At that point, those civilians' lives matter more than your political aims or your ability to justify to your own people that you're using political contractors. So even if opposition can prove that's maybe not the nicest thing to do, to use political contractors, military contractors, then we say that like you have to do it in the most effective in the most effective way possible. The reason that matters and the reason that that's important is because this is a conflict that's already happening. So you've already committed to trying to protect people in a bad situation. We say you have to do that in the most effective way possible. Second point, here's how that happens. So we're told by first opposition that there is a spirit of warfare that private contractors simply can't get involved in, that there are certain things that we have to abide by. Like, insofar as we have laws regulating what is and isn't permissible in war, first of all, like there are certain things you obviously won't be allowed to do. But more importantly, we think a huge amount of what comes out of our armies, because of the closed environment they live in and because of the hiring practices that we see, aimed at people who are maybe at the lower end of socioeconomic ladder, and they're told that by stirring up nationalism within themselves, they will have a value to their country. That encourages hatred towards ragheads. It encourages hatred towards people who do not look the same as you. That's where a huge amount of the abuses that we see, such as US soldiers urinating on people, on dead corpses within Iraq, and get away with it because they're seen as the people they fight against are less than human. That simply does not occur within a private contractor who have people within them that are fighting primarily for profit. So they are there to do a job, not to protect an entire country. They are there to get home and feed their families, not to protect an entire nation. That's the burden that we place on soldiers currently. So we think in certain circumstances, those motivations don't apply to private individuals within a contractor, and therefore the same level of abuses don't take place. Yes?
Don't you think the emphasis on profits itself made this private military contractor or these mercenaries less likely to obey the rule of war, because the rule of war is more tedious to be obeyed, right?
Right, so there are several incentives at play. When it is profit, those incentives tend to allow the good things that we want, because insofar as you don't do those things, then a government that is answerable to its people won't be able to use you again in the future, so you won't have money. Insofar as you're using nationalism, yes, sometimes that will lead you to do the morally correct thing, but in other circumstances, those two things diverge at the point at which you are blinded by the hatred that has been stirred up inside you, which means that you do bad things. Secondly, within this point, we also say that military contractors operate slightly differently to armies. So the first thing within this is that there is a more slimline and direct chain of command. So it's very clear who is in charge of whom, because they are naturally smaller operations with clear ideas of what they're supposed to be doing beforehand, rather than an army, which is a massive operation. So it's more difficult to relay commands and things like that. But more importantly, we also think that armies don't exist just as one thing. If we even look at the US Army, you have the Army, the Marines, the Navy, all of those people with overlapping interests and overlapping abilities to influence the conflict, and indeed want to one-up each other. So they want to be the ones who get to that conflict first, or they want to be the ones who are seen to do the most explosive thing, or whatever. That simply doesn't exist with private military contractors, because they essentially exist within a bubble. They're the only ones that are being used in this instance, so they're not in competition with another agency to one-up them, or whatever. We see this in examples of EO or SCG International, who are particularly effective in countries like Angola, countries like Sierra Leone, who are able to operate a conflict far quicker, because they're focused on specific aims rather than the overarching aim of warfare. The reason that this matters and the way it impacts in the real world is that the biggest problem we see with invading forces is that they tend to stay too long. So with Iraq, with Afghanistan, what that leads to is people losing faith in not just that army, but that government generally, both at home and in the invading country. So you see far more reaction and retaliation. That does not happen to the same extent when you can use private military contractors, because they're able and focus on a specific goal to get out of there, and they're also better at doing it. That means that you have less hatred from within your own country towards that army and those immoral forces that are overstaying their welcome, but also within the invading country, who you want to try and build up and have a functioning democracy or even a country going forward. For those reasons, we're proud to propose.
I'd like to thank Dr. Binus for his speech and welcome the opposition member to
Thank you. First of all, I would like to highlight the fact that we should focus on not immediate deployment, which was focused on by the opening houses, and instead focus on ongoing conflict, which is why the idea of deploying troops immediately is not that relevant. Now we'd like to focus on the nature of these corporations that are championed by the government benches to be as clear, transparent. These corporations can operate in two ways. First of all, they can be hiring international people who they train and then deploy in these countries. In that case, we lose the benefit of having local knowledge or having training, and it's basically the same as deploying your army and just giving other people money to do it. In the other instance, what we have is these big corporations hire local people, recruit locally. And who are these people that they recruit locally? They're often people who have been marginalized by the ruling governments, people who are in the minority, and who are extremists. They're not your common person. They're people who are oppressed or who are against the ongoing situation. Not now, sir. And are people who are not happy with what's going on. These people are likely to be extremists. And often they're hired by these big corporations. So the whole issue of them being liable to a standard and the fact that you might be firing these people, these big corporations, if they're not held up to standards or not acting in the manner, not now, sir, or not acting in the manner which is not right, does not stand. Because if one big corporation is fired, they might actually just end up hiring the same people. Another organization might just end up hiring the same people because ultimately there's a small minority of these people. These people are extremists, and any corporation to win these contracts may just hire these people. Sure.
These contracts are quite lucrative, so you're going to want to get hired. That means there'll be a competitive process by which if someone has a red flag... I get you, sir. That is definitely there. However, because of the limited nature of these people, there's a small number of them, and whenever you're trying to go hire these people, you want to get the job done. And when you're trying to do this, you might end up hiring the same people because you don't have the information. And these local, small bodies of people that you're hiring, they have the incentive to hide things. And that's why you may not be getting the information that you so desire. Now I'd like to talk about the idea which was brought out by the opposition, by the government benches. And they said that it's the presence, not now, sir. It's the presence of foreign forces which diminishes conflicts, forces people to act in a good manner. What we say here is it's the presence of foreign forces, not local people, because you're always doing that. It's the same thing. It's the presence of foreign forces, big powers who you know will go out there and oppress you no matter what. That's what we're saying. We'd also like to talk about the issue we'd like to concede, in fact, that both sides might be doing human rights abuses. However, the army is more likely to deal with these issues in private. They might not be making a big deal out of it. They might not be having a whole Blackwater scandal. But they'll deal with these issues in private because they want to ensure that these things are not repeated and they do not get public coverage. They do not get public coverage. A private corporation, however, knows that if something goes wrong, they want to hide this because A, they can lose their money, their company can go bankrupt, and B, even if you fire these big corporations, another big corporation might end up hiring the same people in the long run.
More information.
Not now, sir, please. Now we say we'd like to agree with the closing half here in that you want to build the economy, you want to have long run goals. We say that's yes. And I'm going to weave this in, this rebuttal, not now, please, sir. We're going to weave this into our importance of how such recruitment of big corporations or mercenaries in general creates an economy which is based on war, and why in the long run this is destabilizing, and why this can lead to many more problems. Please, later, please. In fact, the idea of you stay too long is also something that I'm having a problem with at the moment, because mercenaries or people who you're hiring, as I said, are more likely to have extremist views. This is a very basic premise that I believe that should be agreed upon on both sides, because the normal person, even if they're local, do not want to just fight. Everyone has a...
More information.
Sure.
Okay, Iraq was an active conflict zone where PMCs were the only politically viable way for the US to secure Iraq's oil economy and key government institutions in the Green Zone. Wouldn't it be nice, for example, for them to deploy forces quickly when the Battle of Mosul escalated in 2014? It doesn't respond to our argument simply to talk about active conflicts about apparently being different.
If the army's there, it's present, doesn't really make a difference, does it? What I'm saying is, now I'd like to move on to my substantives, in that, first of all, it's quite likely that these mercenaries can switch sides. Why is this? First of all, they operate on money. And we're talking about local people here, as has been conceded by these people, that they're local people, they have general information. If you're working for money, you might be more likely just to go out, switch sides, because you're working for money, and if the other person's giving you more money, you might just go out there, take their offer. Secondly, they have local interests. Often these mercenaries who are marginalized are from one particular region, one particular area, and they know that they have interest there. Basically, if they know that the ruling government, or the people you're trying to topple, or the opposing force, is going to go harder on you because you're joining this force. You might not want to do it. And you might switch sides at that point of time. That is something which is so critical. And switching sides, why is it wrong? First of all, you transfer information, critical information of the government. And that might just undermine your whole war effort. Secondly, war is a continuous effort. You need nationalism. You need those senses of pride, loyalty, belonging. And unless you have that, you may not want to continue. Now I'd like to say they might also be more likely to switch sides because of local arguments. Religion. There's that common factor between both these sides, and they might be more likely to switch because of these common things. Now I'd like to say that proxy wars, although brought up, would say they're more likely to occur because two big states might want to get involved. Take the US, take Russia, they might want to get involved because they know they will not be held as accountable if they were hiring two local bodies to fight as compared to going in there themselves. Now we'd say that it might create an economy in the long run for the best killers, for the best, more efficient killers. And this does not just monetize the whole warfare issue, which we think is problematic from a human rights perspective in its own, but it creates an economy where everything is based on the transfer of weapons, services, all to do with this. And in the long run, it leads to the creation of people, children who are brought up in an environment in which they're surrounded by guns, all these things, and they might think that these things are acceptable. And as a result, in the long run, it may create problems. Lastly, I'd like to talk really quickly about how human rights will be screwed up and there will be a backlash. Why? Because of an army being involved, there's a possibility of a backlash. When your army is involved, there will be a backlash from international forces if you operate in a manner. However, if you hire mercenaries, what happens is you can just disassociate yourself from them and you're done. However, if you have an army, you're more likely to take care of these issues and you're more likely to not allow these issues to happen. You have those checks and balances there. In the long run, they're extreme. And in the long run, what happens is, as you saw in the case of Afghanistan, in other countries, what happens is extremists often take the ground and they stay there forever because once they get power by the gun, it's unlikely they're going to be benevolent leaders. They're going to be leaders who are just going to oppress people and get what they want to with the power of the arms that you supplied them. Thank you so much.
I'd like to thank the opposition members for his speech, not him, the government, for able to close the government measures today.
First half did a good job of establishing that this would function more effectively than a black market. The problem is that's probably true about everything that's illegal or we don't support ever. You're going to need to employ these as a government. You're going to need to stand over them. We need to prove more than just that it is better, although that is entirely true. We need to prove that it is legitimate for you as a government to enter that specific contract and pay somebody who is not your army to do so. That is the moral point which Paul brought in his extension and the most important aspect in this debate. So first I'm going to talk about legitimacy, second I'm going to talk about efficacy and why they are the most important, they are the most effective way for governments to secure that. Before I do that, there's just three things to note about the last speech. So the first is this idea that, of the nature of these armies, that they are necessarily the most extremist individuals. It is implausible that only extremists are willing to fight at the point at which we can fund armies ourselves and find individuals who are willing to engage in this kind of employment, which are largely dominated by lower socioeconomic groupings. He's correct. You can employ from many places all around the world, and you lose none of the effective benefits that Paul brought you in extensions explicitly, but also most of the benefits the first half talked about in terms of when you have somebody who is already trained and deployed from somebody else or an ex-army individual that you can use from around the world. Obviously, when you have a competitive vetting process, you just don't pick the radical extremists who are likely to be incredibly problematic. This is important because you are their employer at the end of the day. Blackwater was awful, but also reflected badly on America as individuals who are engaging with that, and it is absolutely in your incentive to just pick the right people for the job. But second, he says that an economy is going to build up where you have the best killers. Notice that these are individuals who are motivated only by pleasing those who are contracting with them. So they are motivated specifically by your interests as a government, and you have already engaged. At the point at which you invade a nation, we think it is legitimate to want to do it most effectively and efficiently. This idea of the best killers is in fact a good thing. But they say, no, you're likely to switch side at some point because you can't be trusted. Note as a comparative that these are the most hardened veterans usually. They're the most used to warfare and able to experience that without being terrified for their own lives. The biggest problem is not that you switch side in some sort of personally negotiate your own contract to fight for some sort of dictator. That's not possible in warfare. The problem is that you down your gun and run. That's a problem that they have to deal with, not only with ordinary soldiers, but specifically with conscripts that doesn't engage with them. Finally, they say that there is a backlash that you necessarily have to deal with. Two responses to this. First, that backlash exists when you contracted with somebody who was an awful person, awful PMC, and that name tarnishes yours. So that incentive exists before the act, and that's when we need the incentive to be important to people when they pick which contractor they're going to. But more importantly, I can ditch a bad contractor, like not just in name, but physically I never have to use them again. If I have an awful army, I can't just fire them all. There is an ability for us to maintain going forward and to get around that backlash and getting better outcomes going forward on our side that they don't have when they're stuck with one army on their side. So first off, we want to talk about legitimacy and why this is something that you're willing to do. Paul explains that you roll into a nation, you actively deconstruct all rule, order and law in that place, and you dominate it. You take control of these people's lives, and you singularly have control over that, and thus you take a moral responsibility onto yourself. A responsibility that is worth avoiding your political outcomes, worth avoiding your responsibility to your citizens at home, or any kind of political objective of truth or anything that we would stand over in terms of what an army should do or what it stands for. The most important thing that you do at the point at which you take those, actively take their lives in your hands, is that you safeguard that. That is why at the point at which you engage in this warfare, only after you engage in active military campaign, then you have a duty to do by any means necessarily engage in this utilitarian conduct to look after these individuals. It is only when we establish that on proposition that all of the material about this being utilitarianly helpful or being the most effective way to look after people's lives becomes important, because there's obviously a trade-off in terms of what you lose compared to the individuals who you have to employ to do this, in terms of the responsibility for that government itself. That trade-off is necessary. We are willing to engage in places that we never would with our own soldiers and ask these people to do jobs that we never politically could with our own soldiers, because we have taken this responsibility to look after them. The next thing to say is that there's going to be an abuse, though, because you have a proxy war which is probably going to take place as a result of this. The reality, first off, there's no response to Opening's claim, which is true, that this is obviously transparent in terms of who's looking after them, but also it confuses the fact that we've engaged in a real war in this place. Like the idea that individuals shouldn't be getting involved, and it's problematic that you're now going to be sticking your fingers in too many pies, it ignores the incredibly important context that you have already taken control and gained this moral responsibility to do it in the most effective way possible. Why is it going to be effective? Moving on to the second point in this debate. So, again, first half brought us so far in telling us that they are incredibly likely to regulate themselves because markets work. They tell you that in the vast majority of instances, these are individuals who will root out people at the bottom who are bad eggs. Paul tells you that what's also incredibly important is that we have a safeguard on that, and that we get to choose who we want to employ. So yes, it is probably likely that these people are going to regulate themselves more than any army would, and that's a great benefit. What's more important is that you get to choose between which PMC. So if there is an individual there that is a bad egg, that is not regulating themselves, the necessary outcome or choice that you then have is that you're able to look after them. Note that what's really important about this market mechanism, and I will take you, actually I'll take you now before the bang.
What we're saying here is that there's so many levels. You have private contractors, then hiring local people. There's so many levels that it may get clouded who's a bad egg or not. How do you deal with this issue with private contractors?
The response is what Paul already told you about these being smaller and more manageable than an army to regulate, and so more possible. But more importantly, what we point out is that these aren't motivated personally. They want a profit. Nationalism is actually what leads to the most awful of atrocities, because every soldier has to be conditioned into the idea that it is their personal campaign and they owe something to their country. Not earning their dinner, but a personal vendetta. That means that you have to instill an idea of enemies, of goodies and baddies, as opposed to specific targets, as opposed to a job which you are not in any way emotionally invested in, because you couldn't care less who wins or lose, but you have one job to do. That means, what's really important, doesn't mean that you will be a better person, it means we can control you more properly. In warfare, the most terrifying idea is that a soldier goes rogue. Things like urinating on a corpse, things like slaughtering civilians, is never something that was ordered, but Paul explains why we can control people to better. They say next that these people won't be so trusted. That they won't be sorry. The next important thing is that they can be trusted more effectively because they look more like individuals there. And the most important aspect is that they won't be there for too long, right? The biggest problem is that any army with a flag is setting up an institution. They are not. They are doing one job: security. They are establishing that and getting out as quickly as possible, which means that you don't create that you allow other forces to be built up there, other institutions in that specific state to build themselves up and create some sort of stability going forward instead of creating a vacuum when you eventually pull out. We're proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Government Whip for his speech and welcome the Opposition Whip to close the debate.
Madam Speaker, member of this House, the assumptions done by the entire government bench was there are a lot of choices of PMC to choose, right? We say that is not, there are a lot of choices for PMC for the attacking government to choose. So the attacking government has the leverage to force the PMC to obey the rule of war, to launch a quickest possible attack to make things sweet and short. We say no, that is not the case. We say that the governments that recruits PMC or hire the PMC are often the governments that lack of resources. That's why they need, they lack of resources, whether from the locational perspective, whether from the number perspective. That's why they need these additional resources at the first place. And secondly, it is something emergency, right? And this further reduce the leverage of the government, of the attacking government on negotiating with the PMC. And therefore, this increases the leverage or the negotiating chips for the negotiating chips for the PMC at the first place. So the PMC can easily choose not to obey, demand a lot of things like not reporting the information, not reporting the correct information, or etc., or general things that allow them to launch the attack as quickly as possible and to make life easy for them as much as possible, right? We say that this leverage of negotiation chips for PMC, it's a bad thing. This is a bad thing because given the nature of the PMC, right? These are the people who are not doing charity to begin with. These are the people who are ex-military, who carry guns to have kill people, who have not necessarily bad track records to begin with. So chances are high that they may not necessarily obey the rules of the rules of war at the very first place. They would do whatever it takes to get things done as quickly as possible, including breaching the rule of law. Because because the efficiency and the rule of law may not go hand in hand, right? And precisely this attitude of wanting to get things done easily and quickest way are particularly dangerous because, for example, if you have a military base, if you have a church between your location and the other country's military base, the easiest way is to bomb the church and enter the military base to launch the attack, rather than going the detour and stuff like that. And bombing and stuff like that breach particularly the rule of war. We think that this is a very bad thing. So this is just one of the examples of how efficiency is very dangerous in war. Which is largely ignored by the entire government bench, right? Secondly, they say the attacking government has the control. And has the control and responsibility on the countries that they attack. We totally agree with that. But the hiring of PMC paralyze this mechanism. Why? Because right now the attacker doesn't have the attacking government doesn't have the direct control on the country that's being attacked, because right now there's PMC at the middle of them, and given the bad track record of PMC, we say that the rebuilding effort is likely to make more dangerous. Because the PMC doesn't really have the incentive to rebuild the state that's already being destroyed.
And secondly, in the case which they turn side, in the case which they turn to the opposite government and help the opposite government to attack back, we say that this is a bad thing. Because why? It makes countries that hire the PMC to lose war while the damage has already been done. And therefore, the countries that launch the attack doesn't have the power, no longer have the power or the resources to rebuild the state that they have destroyed and the damage that's being done halfway through the war, right? Because right now they have already lost the war due to the nature of the PMC that's likely to turn side because they emphasize more on the profits.
My information.
Yes, sir.
If the government wants to deploy forces in an area and they can't hire mercenaries, as I said, they just train and arm ethnic or extremist militias exactly as Iran did with the Houthis in Yemen. Assuming the best case scenario for you, why is adding a different and internationally accountable choice a bad thing?
No, we say that adding international, we say that a lot of time this is not a choice for the country that launched the attack due to A, the situation the situation is really emergency. B, the country doesn't really have that much of resources to choose many of the military contractors. So a lot of time they are forced to choose one or two. That's limited, and this give this PMC the leverage on negotiation chips of not to obey the rule of war and get things done really easily. The clash of this debate is that they say these PMC are the really good people because they care about profits. No, thank you. No, thank you. Not necessarily good people, but the fact that they care about profits makes the war safe and can be done as quickly as possible. We say no, because the fact that they care about profit and efficiency and want the fastest way to get everything done as quickly as possible are especially dangerous, no thank you, especially dangerous to warfare, because a lot of times obeying the rule of war is a much more tedious process, right? For example, you cannot kill certain parts of a human and you can only shoot, no thank you, a certain parts. And this complicate the entire attacking process that the PMC they are less likely to take because they only care about efficiency and care about profits. And therefore, we say that efficiency is not something that we should prioritize in warfare, but rather the respect for the government, for the civilian that are being attacked are much better, because if rule of war is being obeyed, there are less chances of backlash from the countries that are being attacked, right? If people are treated properly, when oppositions of the country that are being attacked take place, they will less likely to hate the country that launched the attack at the first place if the rule of war is properly placed, because the rule of war prevent atrocities and necessary cruel stuff to happen, right? We say that, and therefore, in the long run, the respect for the government that are being attacked trump the efficiency, and hiring PMC will only emphasize much on the efficiency, which is not what we really want. We're proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the government opposition whip for his speech and welcome you, Mr. Florence.